seen this play out in my time in government too. Foreign policy communications, particularly around war and peace, can be extremely complex.
Recently, President Trump suggested that allies like Canada stayed a little back from the front lines in Afghanistan.
Well, it's deeply offensive because it's factually wrong. Trump said a few weeks ago, we've never asked him to do anything. It's not true. I was in the room when Donald Rumsfeld asked us to do that. We did it. We rely on the United States to do it. And now we have, a United States ally that's maybe not as reliable as it has been. But now we're starting to realize as well with this trade war with the United States that even our closest ally could choke off key things we need to defend ourselves.
Is there any way we can actually recover and hold on to that Arctic sovereignty or whatever we have left?
It's never too late, but we're way behind.
We were talking about Arctic sovereignty, which has also been like a super, hot topic, but relevant topic, but it's also not a new topic. Arctic sovereignty has been something that Trudeau Sr. was dealing with. Why do you think there is this urgency? There's a lot happening in the world. We talked about uncertainty and everything that else is going on. But not only was this an older issue, but also back in 2022, the Northern Premiers were, signaling the flag and the government didn't seem to react to it. And Russia's been in that space. Now they're rushing to do this defense industrial strategy and investing money in the Arctic. Yeah. Russia's been there for 10 years or so, we could say, surveilling the areas.
Well, longer than that.
Is it a little too late to the government waking up to this issue? Like, is there any way we can actually recover and hold on to that Arctic sovereignty or whatever we have left?
Well, it's never too late, but we're certainly behind in terms of understanding or being able to defend our basic sovereign territory up there. That's the issue. Why haven't governments put more attention to it? I would say the big reason is it's enormously costly. It requires long-term thinking, long-term planning, and long-term investment, and that's not something any government is good at. Let's just be honest about it.
Yeah.
It's a kind of a boiling frog type issue. We've known for at least 30 years that the ice is melting up there, that traffic is increasing, both commercial and potential adversarial military traffic. We know there's resources up there that are valuable. We know we have no real capability to defend our Arctic territory. We rely on the United States to do it. And now we have, a United States ally that's maybe not as reliable as it has been. So it's never too late, but we're way behind, and it's going to take long-term planning, long-term investment to have any kind of an impact up there, in my view.
Yeah. As we're looking more broadly with the different elements that Prime Minister Carney is putting forward, whether it is trade diversification and building up our industries, one interesting piece that I don't think we talk about, or maybe doesn't get the news headlines it needs, but from your vantage point, what would you say Prime Minister Carney's relationship is with the bureaucracy?
Well, that's a good question. I don't really know, but the bureaucracy is changing under him. He's bringing in a few people from outside to lead major files, and that's not unprecedented, but there's been more of it than we've seen in the last probably 10 years. So that's going to be a challenge for the bureaucracy. He's cutting the bureaucracy, and it needs to be cut, in my view. I've written about that, particularly the executive ranks, which got completely out of control in terms of their growth. So that's going to cause some tensions between him and the senior bureaucratic leadership. The clerk is not a career public servant, which is unusual, not unprecedented, but unusual. He has a track record in the public service from a long, long time ago, and then briefly went back in under Trudeau. So those are all challenges in a way to the basic orthodoxies that govern the federal public service. My own view is those orthodoxies need to be challenged, and they've needed to be challenged for a long time. So I'm supportive, but I imagine there's some tensions tough conversations. And if people can't deliver, they should get out of the way. And that, again, is something maybe the public service isn't really used to. That level of demand or expectation of excellence. I don't know that, I mean, he may be demanding more than recent prime ministers, put it that way.
Is he leading more as a banker and an economist rather than the liberal Big L ideology?
Well, I think everybody comes to these jobs with their own experiences. He was a public servant. We haven't had a prime minister who's been a public servant since Pierre Trudeau, who was briefly a public servant in the Privy Council office. So he comes, in a way, he has spent a little bit of time in the public service. The Bank of Canada is different. That's not the public service. It's the broader public sector. He was there as well. So one would think he's got more affinity with the public service than a normal prime minister, certainly more than Mr. Trudeau or Mr. Harper or Mr. Martin, who had no background working as public servants, or even Mr. Chrétien for that matter. So, I think that he has a particular view of what the public service should do based on his own experiences and the needs of the country at this moment, which are greater than we've probably seen in a long, long time. And he expects, I think, very high quality analysis and advice. He's a technocrat. I guess that's what I'm trying to say.
Yeah.
He is a technocrat. In fact, I've described him previously as the most successful technocrat of his generation in the world. There is no one in global history who served as central bank governor of two G7 central banks. He is the uber technocrat, and the public service are supposed to be technocrats. And he's going to demand a very high, I think, is demanding a very high standard of technocracy.
Yeah.
And if they can meet it, things will go well. And if they can't, maybe not so much.
And is this maybe typical of governments where we're seeing him create new institutions like the Build Canada Homes, as well as others? I think there's also one for defense, if I'm not mistaken.
Defense Investment Agency, yeah.
Is this typical behavior? Is this, do you think, again, a signal of, not necessarily trust the bureaucracy, but visually it seems like there's some sort of distancing or not feeling they're at par with what he maybe wants to achieve. Some might say or argue that is that a concentration of power or trying to make it like that? I'm curious.
I've heard those arguments. It's not unusual for a new government to make what we call machinery of government changes, which is what those agencies are. That's not unusual.
Okay.
It is a little bit unusual to put at the head of them people that don't come from the public service or the public sector even. They're basically private sector people, and both in the Major Projects Office, the Defense Investment Agency, and the Build Canada Homes. They all either come from the private or third sector, I think. That's a little bit unusual. And that does send a signal to the bureaucracy, because these are very big priority areas for the government. I guess you could interpret it, if you were in the public services, there wasn't anyone good enough from his point of view to take on those jobs. A rational interpretation of those appointments. And that should send a message to the public service that he's demanded a different standard, perhaps a higher standard, but a different standard in terms of maybe efficiency and worldview and approach. Oh, he's entitled to that. He's the prime minister. These are order and council appointments. He can appoint whoever he wants. And we're used to, it's just public servants that get appointed to deputy minister level jobs. The clerk, as I've said, is not a career public servant. He spent more of his career in the private sector. When I first entered government in 1994, Saby had just left, I think. We'd heard about him because he kind of had this legendary status. He was one of the architects for the GST, so he was known. And then he went out into the private sector. Actually, I think he went into Crown Corporations first. But most of his career has not been in government. It's been working with government.
Yeah.
But it's not been in the public service, although he has a public service dimension to his career. And again, I think that's kind of healthy right now. I'm okay with that.
And I think it's also interesting, he's bringing people out of retirement. For example, the clerk of the Privy Council, Janice Charette, who's going to lead Canada's CUSMA negotiations. Like, I don't know, anything you can comment around that?
Well, if I was a senior public servant, let me put it to you this way, and I saw him bringing in private sector executives to lead brand new agencies that are at the top of the government's priority list, and bringing back retired deputy ministers to lead on key files, I would interpret that as him looking at the senior ranks of the public service and thinking it's not fit for purpose right now. It's not good enough. I think that's a rational interpretation of those moves.
Yeah. Recently, President Trump suggested that allies like Canada stayed a little back from the front lines in Afghanistan. You were working in government when that conflict happened. For Canadians who remember those casualty reports, what did that comment strike in you emotionally?
Well, it's deeply offensive because it's factually wrong. Canada was one of only about 3 countries that was involved in Afghanistan from the very beginning that did not impose what were known as national caveats on their forces. Most countries that went to Afghanistan in these various coalitions that were there starting in the fall of 2001 and going all the way through the next 10, 15 years. Most of those countries, and there were many, many countries in Afghanistan, had national caveats. In other words, their forces could and couldn't do certain things. We didn't do that in Canada. We didn't do that. The British didn't do that. The Dutch didn't do that. Pretty much everyone else, and the Americans didn't do that. So, in other words, we were on the front lines from the very beginning. And later, in the sort of the 05-06 period, we were on the front lines in Kandahar, the most difficult region in the country. I was deeply involved in all those decisions. I know about that. And so it is offensive, what he said. Generally, it's deeply insensitive to people who served and either suffered or their families of people who lost their lives. But it's also factually incorrect. Now, of course, almost everything that comes out of Mr. Trump's mouth is factually incorrect. But not everything he says that's factually incorrect is emotionally disturbing and deeply insensitive. I was really angry about it, but it's typical of his way.
And you've written extensively about the conflict that erupted in Afghanistan, but I want to point to specifically, you were a chief of staff during that time, as we talked about, but you were in the room when the minister received that phone call from the U.S. Defense Secretary asking for Canada's help.
Well, it wasn't a phone call. We were actually in a meeting in the Pentagon with Rumsfeld, and he wanted Canada to take on the leadership of something that was called the International Security Assistance Force in the capital city of Afghanistan, Kabul. And it was a very big ask of Canada. It was in the winter of 2003, the request came. I was there in the discussion. We didn't expect it. It came right out of the blue. Had no forewarning whatsoever that this was going to be tabled in this meeting. And in the end, the Chrétien government considered it seriously for a number of weeks and agreed to do it. And it was a huge contribution for Canada. We went in there with over 2,000 troops. Our army is not very big. It was a huge fraction of our forces. We commanded the mission for about a year, deputy commander as well, and completed the mission during our time there successfully. The main thing it was designed to do was provide stability in the capital, which was not stable at that time, leading into elections in Afghanistan in 2004. So it was a very critical mission. Our Canadian forces did it, and they did a great job. But yeah, that came directly from Rumsfeld. Again, Trump said a few weeks ago, we've never asked them to do anything. It's not true. I was in the room when Donald Rumsfeld asked us to do that, and we did it. So he doesn't know what he's talking about, but what else is new?
Yes. I mean, also, the death toll is a reality.
Well, the death toll on that mission was relatively low, but later when we went back into Kandahar, the death toll by Canadian standards was very high. But that was a different mission a couple years later.
You've actually compared that or used parallel the Korean War. Why that specific example?
This mission that we took on in Kabul in 2003 was the largest deployment of Canadian forces since the Korean War. So that's one reason why I've used that as a kind of a comparator. We've never taken on anything that significant in terms of the number of forces we had to deploy in. I mean, at the time, I think the Canadian Army was maybe 20,000 troops total, and we had 2,200 of them in Kabul. And that means you need a lot more than 2,200 because they're going in for like 6-month rotations. And they were in there for about 18 months. And there's a lot of back infrastructure that's doing the training. So it exhausted our ability to deploy anywhere else. Frankly, there were people that didn't think that we were even capable of mounting a mission of that size. Well, we did, on a low base of troops.
Yeah.
So it is, in my mind at least, in terms of the scale of it, it was significant, and it was the most significant thing we've done since the Korean War.
I really appreciate you sharing that, because I think, again, so much has happened in such a short frame of time. I think it gets lost in a lot of people's memory.
Yeah, it's kind of our forgotten war. In a way, I guess I don't know if people want to forget it or we just decide to forget it, but
Yeah.
kind of is that. I would agree.
Yeah. But, as we're just wrapping up, one of the big things I try to do with this podcast is break down how government works, what politics is. Could you explain a little bit, like, what is the role of the chief of staff? It is a very big role. You're a bit of that. We were talking with a lot of senators today. I want to say maybe that sober second thought for a minister. Like, how do you keep a minister grounded when chaos is unfolding? Afghanistan, you've been in government when 9/11 happened.
Yeah. Well, I would say the role has changed over time, for one thing. I think it depends a little bit on the government of the day and the prime minister of the day, number one. Number two, it depends on the minister. Different ministers have different, at least in my time, had different views on the role of the chief of staff. I don't think you can model it.
Okay.
I think it is personality dependent in terms of the prime minister and the ministers. Now, in my case, I worked as chief of staff to two different ministers, and I had a unique relationship with them. And I look back on it now and I think, they became friends. In fact, I was friends at the time, which maybe isn't such a good thing. I don't know, but that's the way it evolved. And so I had their trust, and it was at a time when the Prime Minister's office did not appoint chiefs of staff. Ministers hired chiefs of staff. Prime Minister's office had a veto, but they didn't get heavily involved in those days. And I believe that's the correct model. Now it's different, as I understand it. It's basically like a deputy minister appointment. The center decides.
They're given a list of who can you pick from.
Well, there was a bit of that, I think, at times. But generally, it was up to the minister to make the choice. And if it was a deeply offensive person for some reason, Prime Minister's office could intervene and block it. But I think rarely did in the two governments that I worked in. But the basic role is, as I say, it's you're kind of the alter ego, or at least I was in a way. And you have to deal with a lot of things that the minister doesn't have time to deal with, that need to be dealt with, especially in a big portfolio like national defense. Basic things like I had signing authority for the minister. Now that's an extremely powerful thing to have. In those days it was called the auto pen.
Yeah.
So I was effectively the minister. I mean, I didn't have to check with him. They trusted me to sign things in their absence when they were not there. And I was exercising that multiple times every day on very small things, sometimes like on expense claims for generals. Believe it or not, those things had to be signed off by the minister, up to and including cabinet submissions and other big spending, Treasury Board submissions and other things. So, you can have a role like that.
Yeah.
You can have a role where you have a political function, obviously, but you also have a policy function. Or you can have different roles. It depends on really how the minister wants it done and how they carve it out. So I don't really believe you can model it. Now, today, I don't know how it works because I'm not in there. I've heard different things. Well, one of the things, too, in my time, it was very important for chiefs of staff to have excellent relationships with deputy ministers. And I think most of the time that was the case. I hear it's different now. That is a huge problem, in my view.
Why?
The chief of staff needs to work closely and regularly and frequently with the deputy. When I was at National Defense, I was in our deputy's office, or she was in my office, multiple times every single day. We were on the same floor. Her chief of staff was in to see me all the time. We met regularly. I was in to see her. She was in to see me all the time. And that's how it should work. You have to have good relations. And that means you have to have face-to-face relations.
Yeah.
Doing all this stuff over email doesn't work. It's a recipe for problems. We saw it in the Trudeau government. People saying, well, we told so-and-so in an email and that box is checked. No, it's not the way to do it.
Yeah.
It's a recipe for problems, and they had all kinds of problems as a result of it. Not the way to run the railroad.
But my last question for you is, if you could give any minister advice right now, which minister would it be, and what's the advice you'd give them?
That's a tough one. Which minister would it be? There's 3 or 4 ministers right now that I think are 4 or 5 that are really critical to the government's agenda.
Yeah.
I guess I would say to the industry minister and the defense minister, they need to work really closely together on pulling off this defense industrial strategy. It's very important for the country. Given the amount of money that's going into that portfolio, it's critically important that the public sees a big return on that investment. It's a social license almost. The government does not have a social license to spend 2 or 3.5% of GDP on defense. It just doesn't. There's public opinion polls that show that there's support for defense spending increases, but none of them do the trade-off analysis. The public doesn't understand the trade-off. The trade-off is coming, as we discussed. So those two ministers in particular are key to making sure that defense industrial agenda comes together, works, is executed, and demonstrates to the public that you can do two things at the same time. You can rebuild your military and enhance Canadian sovereignty and build a more productive, resilient economy, which is critical to national defense and Canadian sovereignty. Those are two sides of the same coin. Mm-hmm. Those two ministers are the key ones that in the portfolio ministers that need to make that happen. And clearly that's what the Prime Minister wants. He's been crystal clear on that in my mind. Mm-hmm. So it's over to those two to deliver it.
So we'll see.
We'll see.
We'll see. Well, thank you so much, Eugene. I really appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah,
it's been a blast.
you. Yeah, I'm so happy.
Cheers.
Cheers.